Hey everyone! Tonight we're going to drift back, way back, to the dawn of a nation that liked to call itself free. So, dim the lights, grab whatever keeps you calm, tea, a blanket, maybe a mild sense of historical dread, and settle in. Because tonight we're talking about the history of American slavery and the long shadow it left behind. Now, don't worry, this isn't one of those fast-paced crash course kind of things. We're not here to race through names and dates. We're here to wander, slowly, through the contradictions that built America. Liberty and bondage, freedom and control. The dream of equality built on unpaid labor. It's a heavy topic, but we'll take it gently. The first ships and the first ironies. Let's start in the early 1600s, when the English colonies were still more idea than empire. In 1619, a ship called the White Lion arrived in Virginia. It carried about 20 Africans captured from a Portuguese slave ship. They were traded for food. And just like that, the first enslaved Africans entered English North America. Now, the irony is almost too neat. 1619 was also the year the colony's first representative assembly met in Jamestown, an early experiment in self-government. So, within months, the same soil saw two great American traditions begin side by side: democracy and slavery. Because, of course, it did. At first, slavery wasn't yet the lifelong, race-based system it would become. Some Africans worked as indentured servants, technically able to earn freedom. But very quickly, colonists realized that temporary servitude wasn't nearly as profitable as permanent, hereditary slavery. And colonial laws began to shift accordingly. By the late 1600s, Virginia passed laws declaring that the child of an enslaved woman would also be enslaved. It was a convenient way to ensure the system could reproduce itself, literally. Freedom was no longer a possibility. Slavery had become not just an economic tool, but a legal identity written into the very DNA of colonial life, the plantation dream. The southern colonies were especially fond of this system. The land was fertile, and tobacco, rice, and later cotton became their golden ticket. But someone had to do the backbreaking labor. And well, enslaved Africans did. The plantation became the empire's favorite machine. From the outside, it looked calm. White columns, green fields, that postcard of Southern charm that old movies still romanticize. But behind the image was endless work, brutal punishment, and an entire social order built on control. The enslaved weren't just laborers, they were also the foundation of wealth. Their bodies were property, collateral, even counted in taxes. When planters took loans, human beings were the security, and when they died, those assets were listed right next to livestock and furniture in estate records, neatly itemized, because bureaucracy never misses a chance to organize suffering. In northern colonies, slavery existed too, though on a smaller scale. New York City, for example, had a large enslaved population in the 1700s. They built roads, docks, and houses that the city still stands on today. But as the northern economy shifted toward trade and manufacturing, slavery became less central there. That didn't mean northerners were innocent, just that their profits came more indirectly, through shipbuilding and the trade networks that carried sugar and cotton and human cargo. Freedom for some. By the mid-18th century, the colonies were buzzing with revolutionary talk. No taxation without representation, liberty or death, all that good stuff. And yet, by that point, there were nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans in British America. So the land of the free idea was already, let's say, aspirational. It's hard not to notice the absurdity. Men like Thomas Jefferson could write about inalienable rights while owning hundreds of people. He even wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, which, if you're being generous, you could interpret as eventually, maybe, some men under specific circumstances are created equal, because ideals are cleaner when they stay on paper. But it wasn't just hypocrisy. It was economic logic. Slavery was the engine of colonial wealth. Without it, many of those revolutionaries wouldn't have had their plantations, their profits, and their powdered wigs. Freedom, in the American imagination, was always partly financed by bondage. The Revolution's half-promise. When the Revolution came, the question of slavery hovered in the background like an awkward guest at a dinner party. Some enslaved people fled to join the British, who promised freedom to anyone who fought for the crown. Others fought for the Americans, hoping that victory might mean liberty. Spoiler, it usually didn't. After independence, the new United States made a few gestures toward change. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 banned slavery in new territories north of the Ohio River. That sounds noble, until you realize it was less about moral awakening and more about balancing political power between regions. Slavery wasn't being ended, it was being managed. And when the founders wrote the Constitution, they didn't exactly rise to the occasion. They avoided the word slavery entirely, too impolite for such a refined document. But the system is in there, between the lines. The infamous 3/5 compromise decided that enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. So the South got extra political power based on people who couldn't vote, speak, or own themselves. You could call it clever or just horrifyingly efficient. Cotton and chains. Then came the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, courtesy of Eli Whitney, who probably didn't realize he was about to supercharge slavery. The machine made cotton processing far easier, turning the crop into America's white gold. And suddenly, the demand for enslaved labor exploded. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the South. It's one of history's bleak ironies. At the same time, America was bragging about its progress, railroads, telegraphs, steamboats. It was also perfecting one of the most efficient forced labor systems in the modern world. The cotton fields stretched endlessly, and so did the profits. Northern textile mills spun southern cotton into fabric. British factories turned it into empire-wide exports. And through it all, human lives were the raw material. Families were torn apart and sold across state lines. Children grew up watching their parents taken away, often never to see them again. And yet, in the quiet corners of that suffering, people found ways to survive. Songs, secret marriages, whispered stories of Africa, and dreams of freedom that passed from one generation to the next. Those small acts of endurance were in their own way revolutions too. A country divided by its foundations. By the mid-18th century, the tension between free and slave states had become unbearable. Each new territory added to the Union was a potential flashpoint. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each was like putting another patch on a ship that was already sinking. Everyone knew the core contradiction. The United States couldn't keep preaching liberty while half its population was enslaved. But denial was easier. It usually is. Slaveholders argued that their system was actually benevolent. claiming enslaved people were better off under Christian care. They published pamphlets about the moral duty of masters and the natural order of races. It was the same self-justifying tone you hear from any empire, kindness as a mask for control. And when abolitionists challenged them, they called it an attack on Southern honor, because nothing says honor like unpaid labor enforced by whips. Quiet rebellion. Despite everything, enslaved people resisted, quietly, subtly, constantly. They broke tools,
slowed work, ran away, or used songs to communicate plans. Some escaped through the Underground Railroad, a loose network of secret routes and safe houses stretching from the South to Canada. It wasn't an actual railroad, of course, but it might as well have been. Thousands found freedom along its invisible tracks. And then there were revolts, like Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, which terrified white Southerners into even harsher laws. Because the greatest fear of a slave-holding society isn't invasion, it's uprising. The system depended on obedience, and obedience depends on terror. The coming storm. By the 1850s, it was clear the country was splitting in two moral universes. The North, increasingly industrial and anti-slavery in rhetoric, if not in practice, versus the South, clinging to its plantation economy like a religion. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the South decided that was enough democracy for one lifetime and began seceding. The Civil War followed, a war that, no matter how it was framed at the time, was fundamentally about slavery. And here's the sad symmetry. The war that would finally end slavery also killed more Americans than any other conflict in the nation's history. Roughly 620,000 lives lost to settle a question that should never have needed asking. Freedom was won, but paid for in blood. Let's pause there, on that uneasy edge before emancipation, because next time we'll drift through the war itself, the slow, reluctant march toward freedom, and what came after: Reconstruction, segregation, and the long echo of inequality that still hums beneath the surface of the American story. But for now, just breathe. History moves slowly, and so should we. Hey again. Welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive. And if you've drifted off and somehow returned for the next part, that's okay too. History has that effect on people. Last time, we left off right before the Civil War, that long, grinding conflict that split the United States in two. Tonight, we'll drift through that storm, not in battle scenes or trumpet blasts, but in the slow human unraveling of a country learning what freedom actually means and what it costs. So, let's settle in. The fire's low, the past is patient, and the story continues. A house divided. When the southern states began seceding in 1860, they didn't exactly hide their reasons. Their declarations of independence were basically long essays about protecting slavery. They called it property rights and states' rights, but those rights all circled back to one thing: the right to own other human beings. Abraham Lincoln, still new to the presidency, tried to be careful. He said he wanted to save the Union, not destroy slavery. He wasn't an abolitionist crusader, not at first. But history has a way of dragging people into their own principles, and before long, his moderate promises couldn't survive the reality of war. By 1861, the nation had come apart at the seams. The Confederacy formed its own government with complete constitution that guaranteed slavery forever. Their president, Jefferson Davis, called it a fight for independence, which is one way to describe a rebellion against freedom. The anti-slavery sentiment in the North was growing, but not all Northerners were abolitionists. But the stuck system of slavery was a moral affront to a growing number of people. The slow birth of emancipation. At first, the Union armies didn't march to end slavery. They marched to preserve the Union. But enslaved people themselves forced the issue. Whenever Union troops approached, enslaved men and women fled plantations and sought refuge behind Union lines, thousands of them. They called themselves contraband of war because technically, in the twisted logic of the time, they were enemy property. It's darkly poetic in a way. Freedom started as a military loophole. But it was a beginning. And in 1862, Lincoln began drafting the Emancipation Proclamation. He waited until a Union victory to announce it. Appearances mattered, even in revolution. When he finally did, on January 1, 1863, he declared all enslaved people in Confederate territory to be free. It didn't instantly free everyone, far from it. The proclamation only applied to rebel states, not the loyal border states where slavery still existed. But symbolically, it was seismic. For the first time, the war had a moral center. It wasn't just about keeping a country together, it was about redefining what that country was. Of course, some Northern soldiers grumbled. Not everyone was thrilled to be fighting for emancipation. Racism wasn't confined to the South. But as the war dragged on, black soldiers began joining the Union ranks, over 180,000 of them by the end. They fought for a country that hadn't yet fully accepted them because they understood what was at stake. And in the quiet courage of those regiments, America got its first glimpse of what freedom for all might actually look like. The cost of liberation. The war itself was brutal, endless, and mostly miserable. People like to remember the big moments, Gettysburg, Antietam, Appomattox, but most of it was mud, disease, and hunger. For enslaved people still trapped on plantations, the approach of Union troops meant everything. Freedom often came as a rumor first, whispered, half-believed, almost mythical. Then came soldiers, sometimes with tattered flags, sometimes with nothing but worn boots and conviction. And for many, that was the moment the world shifted. In June 1865, long after the war had effectively ended, Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas, to announce the end of slavery. That day became Juneteenth, the day freedom finally reached the last corners of bondage. It should have been pure celebration, and it was, briefly. But freedom, as America would soon learn, is much easier to declare than to maintain. Rebuilding the ruins. After the war came Reconstruction, the awkward, painful process of putting the country back together. The South lay in ruins. Plantations were burned, railroads destroyed, entire cities hollowed out. 4 million people were suddenly free, but with no land, no compensation, and very little protection. It was freedom, yes, but freedom dropped into a void. The federal government tried at first to help. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to provide food, education, and legal aid. It built schools, negotiated labor contracts, and even helped reunite families torn apart by slavery. It was the enormous task, and the resistance was immediate. Former slaveholders weren't exactly ready to give up control. They passed the Black Codes, laws designed to keep freedmen in a state as close to slavery as possible. People could be arrested for vagrancy, then forced into labor contracts. It was slavery by another name. Because, as it turns out, old habits die hard, especially when those habits built your mansion. Congress pushed back, creating the 14th and 15th Amendments, granting citizenship and voting rights to black men. And for a brief, fragile moment, it seemed like real change was possible. Black Americans were elected to state legislatures, even to Congress. Schools flourished. Communities began to build something new out of centuries of destruction. It was one of the most hopeful, radical experiments in democracy the country had ever seen. And then came the backlash.
The long counter-revolution. White Southerners called it redemption, as if regaining control of their governments was some holy act. They formed militias, terrorized black voters, and used violence to undo Reconstruction piece by piece. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose in the night, burning schools, lynching freedmen, threatening anyone who dared to participate in this fragile new democracy. The North, exhausted by war and an economic depression, eventually lost interest. Federal troops withdrew in 1877, marking the end of Reconstruction. And the South wasted no time rewriting its laws. Again, what followed were the Jim Crow decades, segregation, disenfranchisement, and a rigid racial caste system that lasted nearly a century. So after all that, the war, the blood, the speeches, the promise of freedom collapsed into something quieter, meaner, and more enduring. Slavery had ended, but the habits of hierarchy remained. People still found ways to measure worth by skin, to police belonging, to decide who counted as American. And for those left out, freedom was mostly theoretical. Memory and amnesia. What's strange about American history is how quickly it learned to forget. By the early 1900s, textbooks called slavery a peculiar institution, as if it were just a quirky regional thing. Plantation owners became gentlemen farmers. Confederate generals were painted as tragic heroes, and monuments began to rise. Tall, solemn, and misleading, celebrating the very people who fought to preserve bondage. The country wanted healing, not guilt, and so it did what it often does. It rewrote the story to make itself look brave and sad instead of cruel and complicated, because that's easier to live with. But beneath that polished myth, the truth lingered. Sharecropping kept black families tied to the same land they once worked as slaves. Violence kept them from the ballot box. And the law itself became a tool of control. Separate but equal, the court said, though everyone knew which side got the splinters. The echo in the modern age. Even after slavery was long gone, its architecture remained, invisible but solid. Housing policies, school systems, wealth gaps, policing, all of it traced back to those early blueprints. The idea that some people's labor and suffering could build other people's comfort didn't vanish. It just changed uniforms. And yet history is never static. Every generation chipped at that legacy in its own way. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was another reconstruction, this time televised. Marches replaced militias. Court cases replaced battlefields. It was slower, but the stakes were the same. Who gets to belong in the story of America? Even today, the echoes remain. In debates about race, justice, and memory. You can still see them in the way history is taught, in the monuments we argue over, in the silence that follows when someone mentions reparations. It's all there just beneath the surface, humming like an old song you can't quite forget. The quiet weight of legacy. The legacy of slavery isn't a ghost. It's more like gravity. You don't see it, but everything still bends around it. The wealth gap, the neighborhoods, the schools, the politics, all still tilted by those centuries of unpaid labor and systematic exclusion. And sometimes, when people talk about the past, they ask, why can't we just move on? But history doesn't move on just because we want it to. It lingers, patient and heavy, waiting for recognition. And maybe that's what remembering really is. Not guilt, not blame, but acknowledgement. The simple act of saying, yes, this happened. And it still shapes us. The sleep of history.